In a quiet town, a girl walked into school with her cane, her eyes clouded but her spirit unshaken. She was blind, different, and that made her an easy target. What the bullies didn't know was that her father wasn't just any man. He was trained for war, a Navy SEAL who had spent years fighting in silence, waiting for the right moment to protect what he loved most. This is the story of how cruelty met courage, and how justice was delivered in a way no one saw coming. On the first morning at her new school, the blind girl stepped out of the car with her cane in hand, her posture calm, her steps measured. The air buzzed with chatter, sneakers squeaked across polished floors, and lockers clanged shut. She moved slowly, guided not by sight but by sound, her cane tapping rhythmically across the tiles. Each tap was deliberate, every pause thoughtful, as she listened to the echoes bouncing back. Her movements carried a quiet strength, a sense of discipline that came from years of practice and the unshakable support of her father. Yet, in a place where first impressions mattered, her difference was like a spotlight. Some students turned to look, their eyes filled with curiosity, while a few offered polite greetings or reached out to help her find her classroom. For a brief moment, it seemed like the day might pass with kindness. But not all eyes held warmth. A group of students seated near the back of the hallway smirked when they noticed her cane sweeping ahead of her. They whispered to each other, laughing quietly at every cautious step she took. When she passed near them, one casually slid a backpack into her path. Her cane struck it, and she stumbled, clutching her balance with a quick adjustment of her foot. The hallway erupted in small bursts of laughter, and though she didn't see their smirks, she felt the sting in their voices. Still, she straightened herself, lifted her chin, and continued walking as though nothing had happened. Silence became her armor, and composure her shield. The day wore on, and she navigated classroom after classroom with remarkable awareness. She could hear the shuffle of papers, the faint scratching of pencils, even the sighs of impatience when teachers asked for quiet. Some classmates admired her courage and tried to guide her, but the bullies lingered, watching her every move like predators circling prey. In the cafeteria, when she set her tray down carefully, they took the opportunity to hide her food, sliding the plate across the table just out of reach. She extended her hand to find it, but her fingers touched only empty space. Laughter rippled through the table nearby. She froze, then quietly folded her hands in her lap, pretending she wasn't hungry. It was easier to let the moment pass than to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. At home, her father noticed the hesitation in her voice, the slight delay in her responses when he asked how school was. He was a man of discipline, his presence, commanding even in silence, yet when he spoke to his daughter, his tone softened. Sitting at the kitchen table, he placed his calloused hands gently over hers and reminded her of what he had always said. Blindness was not a weakness. It was another kind of strength. He had trained her to use her hearing like radar, to count steps, to read the world through textures, temperatures, and the smallest vibrations. The world thinks your eyes are closed, he told her, but you see things they never will. Never forget that. His words settled into her like steady anchors, keeping her from drifting too far into despair. But the cruelty at school didn't stop. If anything, it grew sharper. The bullies recorded short clips of her tapping her way through the hallways and posted them online with mocking captions. They placed chairs slightly off position in classrooms, so she would bump against them while finding her desk. Once, as she made her way through the library, they whispered her name from different directions, laughing as she turned her head toward each false sound. Each act chipped away at her calm, but she refused to show it. In her silence, she carried the weight of every insult, every stumble, every stolen lunch, building a wall of quiet strength brick by brick. Though no one could see it, a storm was forming beneath her calm exterior. The bullies believed they were breaking her, that her blindness made her helpless, but they could not see the resilience forged in her home. Every night, when she practiced moving swiftly with her cane, or memorize the layout of her room by heart, her father stood close, teaching her to stay aware of what others ignored. He told her there would come a day when she must choose whether to remain silent or to stand tall, and that day would define her forever. The girl tucked those words deep inside, waiting, enduring, and listening to the world with ears sharper than anyone around her. What the bullies didn't realize was that, in mocking her, they were only feeding the fire that would soon turn back on them. Each cruel laugh, each whispered taunt, and each obstacle pushed in her path was planting seeds. Seeds that would one day grow into a reckoning they would never expect. For now, she walked the halls in silence, her cane tapping steadily like the ticking of a clock counting down. The storm had not yet arrived, but its first winds were beginning to stir. The cruelty grew sharper with every passing day. What began as whispered jokes and stolen lunches quickly turned into dangerous games. The bullies pulled away her chair just as she lowered herself, sending her tumbling to the floor while the classroom erupted in laughter. They threw crumpled paper and erasers at her from across the room, mocking her confusion when she turned her head, trying to locate the sound. They mimicked the tap of her cane, clattering pens against the desk, pretending to stumble like her, turning her every movement into a performance for their amusement. Though the teachers caught glimpses of mischief, the bullies always covered their tracks with practiced innocence, pointing fingers elsewhere or claiming it was all a misunderstanding. One afternoon, during recess, the cruelty reached a new height. They whispered to her that there was an open practice in the gym, that someone had asked her to come. Trusting the words, she followed the familiar count of her steps and entered the echoing gymnasium. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, she realized something was wrong. The space was too quiet, the air heavy with the sound of muffled laughter waiting to erupt. Her cane tapped against the wooden floor, each strike echoing into the open space, and suddenly shadows began to shift around her. The bullies had surrounded her, forming a circle, their footsteps shuffling just beyond her reach. They began taunting her, their voices darting from side to side, mocking her blindness, daring her to find them. One nudged her shoulder, another pulled at her sleeve, while laughter exploded all around her. She spun, trying to orient herself, but the circle shifted, closing in like predators around prey. Her hands tightened around her cane, her breath steadying, and in that moment she heard her father's voice in memory, calm and commanding. Count your steps, listen to the vibrations, trust the air. She stilled herself, tuning out the laughter, focusing only on the rhythm of their movements, the shuffle of shoes against the polished wood, the bounce of sound from the far walls, the uneven breathing of those too amused by their own cruelty. All of it painted a map in her mind. When one of them shoved her lightly from behind, she steadied herself and turned in the exact direction of the sound. The bullies paused, their laughter faltering when she faced them with eerie precision. Though she could not see their smirks, she lifted her chin and stood tall, refusing to let her tears fall. For the first time, her silence was not submission, but defiance. She did not scream, did not beg, did not collapse into the helplessness they craved. Instead, she planted her feet firmly, gripping her cane like a staff, her unflinching posture louder than any cry could have been. The bullies, startled by her composure, laughed louder to cover their unease. Just as quickly, they slipped out, when the bell rang, leaving her standing alone in the echoing gym. By the time a teacher arrived, she was already making her way toward the exit, her face calm but her hands trembling. The bullies claimed it had been a misunderstanding, that they were only joking, only playing. Teachers, eager to keep the peace, dismissed it, and the truth vanished beneath polished excuses. But at home, her father was not fooled. He noticed the small bruises hidden beneath her sleeves, the hesitations in her words when he asked about her day. He saw the way her confidence wavered, how her usual spark had dimmed, how she spoke less and listened more. The silence between them told him everything her lips would not. He had spent years studying the details others overlooked, and now those skills sharpened in his own home. Quietly, he began to watch. When he dropped her at school, he lingered nearby. When he picked her up, he scanned the faces around her, measuring their smirks and whispers. From the shadows, the instincts of a Navy SEAL returned. He was no longer just a father, but a guardian waiting for the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, the bullies were not satisfied. Their failed attempt to break her resolve in the gym only fueled their determination. They whispered to each other about their next idea, something bigger, something that would not only embarrass her, but possibly put her in danger. They spoke of it with laughter, unaware that each reckless plan was drawing them closer to the very storm they could not imagine. While the blind girl endured, keeping her father's lessons alive within her, the bullies mistook her silence for weakness. They could not see that every shove, every cruel word, and every staged humiliation was writing their own downfall. The biggest prank they planned would be their last, for it would awaken the wrath of a protector who had faced war itself and who would stop at nothing to defend his daughter. The bullies' cruelty had reached its peak, and now they wanted a spectacle. Their whispers grew bolder, their laughter sharper, as they plotted something to humiliate her in front of the entire school. The plan was simple, but vicious. During the upcoming assembly, when she was called to the stage to speak, they would shift the edge of the rug, place an obstacle in her path, and wait for her to stumble. With cameras ready in their pockets, they planned to record her fall, upload it online, and spread it like wildfire until she became nothing more than a cruel joke across the internet. They imagined the roar of laughter from the crowd, the helpless expression on her face, and the validation of their power. It was, in their minds, the perfect prank. The day of the assembly arrived, and the auditorium buzzed with restless energy. Students filled the rows of chairs, whispering and scrolling through their phones as teachers tried to restore order. The stage was set with a microphone at the center, the school banner draped behind it, and the wooden floor gleaming under the harsh lights. Backstage, the blind girl stood waiting, her cane tapping lightly against the floor as she counted the steps in her mind. Her heart pounded, but she steadied her breathing, remembering her father's words. She was not weak. She was not broken. She was walking into the light with courage, and no matter what they threw at her, she would not let them see her bend. When her name was called, a hush fell over the room. She stepped forward, each tap of her cane echoing in the stillness, her head held high. Her movements were slow but steady, graceful in their precision. The bullies smirked from the front row, exchanging glances as one of them shifted his foot to nudge the obstacle into place. Phones tilted upward, recording, hungry for her humiliation. She approached the microphone, unaware of the trap inches, away from her. But before disaster could strike, another presence moved in the shadows. Her father, who had been quietly watching from the back of the auditorium, saw the subtle shift, the cruel grin, the sly motion of a foot. His instincts sharpened instantly. He moved with quiet precision, faster than the eye could follow, stepping forward at the exact moment her cane tapped near the obstacle. In one smooth motion, he adjusted the path with the slightest nudge, making sure she cleared it safely. The crowd saw nothing but a protective figure adjusting the stage. The bullies froze, their prank disrupted before it could unfold. Their confidence suddenly fractured. The girl reached the microphone and paused. She stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the stand, her face calm yet determined. Her voice carried through the auditorium, steady and strong. She spoke about strength, about living in a world of darkness but refusing to be consumed by it. She spoke of independence, of not being defined by what others believed she lacked. And she spoke of hope, that, even in the face of cruelty, one could choose dignity over despair. Every word rang with truth, and the silence in the room deepened, her message cutting through the restless whispers like a blade. Her father stood nearby, watching with quiet pride. When she finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause, genuine and thunderous. But he wasn't finished. He stepped forward, not as a man overcome with anger, but as a teacher delivering a lesson. His voice was firm yet calm, his tone measured with the discipline of someone who had faced greater battles than these. He exposed the prank for what it was, revealing to the crowd what the bullies had intended. He pointed out their laughter, their preparations, their hidden phones. The evidence was undeniable, and the entire room turned to stare at them, their smirks now crumbling under the weight of shame. But instead of exploding with fury, he did something far more powerful. He controlled the moment. He explained that fear and cruelty were the tools of the weak, that mocking someone for their challenges did not make one stronger but only revealed their emptiness. He spoke of discipline, of honor, and of the strength that came from protecting rather than destroying. His words carried the authority of a Navy SEAL, a man who had spent years mastering control in the most dangerous of circumstances. The students listened, spellbound, the bullies shrinking into their seats, unable to meet his gaze. When he finished, the auditorium was silent, the air heavy with realization. The blind girl no longer stood as the victim of their ridicule. She had become the embodiment of resilience, her voice echoing in their minds, her courage undeniable. In that moment, the balance of power shifted forever. She was no longer defined by her blindness or their cruelty. She was a symbol of strength, and they were exposed for what they truly were, cowards hiding behind laughter. The applause that followed shook the room, not for the bullies, not for their prank, but for the girl who stood tall, and the father, who reminded everyone that true strength was not in breaking others, but in lifting them higher. The assembly changed everything. What was meant to be a cruel prank had instead turned into a revelation, and the truth could no longer be hidden. The whispers of the bullies' scheme spread like wildfire through the student body, and by the end of the day, everyone knew what they had tried to do. Teachers who had once looked the other way could no longer deny the evidence, and parents who had believed their children's innocence were now confronted with undeniable shame. The blind girl, who had endured in silence for so long, suddenly stood at the center of attention, not as a victim, but as a figure of strength. The humiliation that was supposed to crush her had instead exposed the weakness of her tormentors. Meetings were called. Parents of the bullies sat stiffly in the principal's office, their faces pale as their children squirmed in their chairs. The once smirking students were now cornered, unable to explain away the recordings on their phones or the eyewitness accounts of their cruel laughter. Suspension was immediate, and for the first time, they were stripped of the power they had, wielded so carelessly. But the punishment did not stop there. They were assigned mandatory community service, forced to spend weekends helping those they had mocked, and their names were announced publicly, no longer hidden behind the safety of whispers. Accountability weighed heavily on them, and the humiliation they had planned for another became their own burden to carry. The father, who had revealed their cruelty with calm precision, was invited to speak to the entire school. He stood in the auditorium once again, this time not as a shadow in the background, but as a voice everyone was eager to hear. His presence commanded silence before he even spoke. When his words came, they were measured, deliberate, and powerful. He explained that strength was not found in mocking the vulnerable, but in protecting them. He reminded the students that cruelty was the weapon of the insecure, and that underestimating someone because of what they lacked was the surest way to reveal one's own weakness. He spoke of the discipline he had learned as a Navy SEAL, of the importance of respect, of looking beyond the surface of a person to see the strength within. His words did not come like a lecture, but like a challenge, one that forced every student to examine themselves and decide what kind of person they wanted to be. The blind girl sat quietly in the front row, listening to her father's voice carry through the room. For the first time, she felt the weight of eyes on her that were not filled with ridicule but with admiration. Her peers, who had once giggled behind her back or stood by in silence, now looked at her with respect. They remembered how she had walked onto that stage, unshaken, and spoken with courage that none of them had expected. She was no longer just the girl with the cane, no longer defined by what she could not see. She had become a symbol of resilience, someone who had faced cruelty head-on and refused to be broken. In the weeks that followed, the change was undeniable. Students who had once ignored her now stopped to greet her, offering their arm as she walked through crowded hallways, not out of pity, but out of respect. Teachers praised her strength during class discussions, pointing to her as an example of perseverance. Even strangers began to whisper her name with admiration, telling the story of how she had stood against bullies and walked away stronger. The girl, once invisible in her silence, had become a beacon of courage for everyone who felt overlooked or underestimated. The bullies, meanwhile, were left to confront their own failures. Stripped of their audience, burdened with community service, and watched by the very people they had mocked, they were forced to face the truth of who they had been. Their arrogance faded, their laughter hollow, as they realized the damage they had caused and the emptiness that fueled it. For the first time, they were not in control. They had become the example of what happens when cruelty meets strength, when mockery collides with resilience. Through it all, the girl walked forward with a quiet confidence she had never shown before. Guided by her father's love and the lessons he had instilled in her, she carried herself with the certainty that she was far more than her blindness. She was proof that courage could not be dimmed, that resilience could outshine ridicule. Every step she took with her cane was steady, every word she spoke held weight, because she knew now that she was seen for who she truly was. And in the final lesson, spoken not with words but with her life, she showed that sometimes the strongest vision does not come from the eyes at all. It comes from the heart that endures, from the spirit that refuses to bend, and from the soul that sees the world more clearly than sight ever could.